Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, I wanted to go over a topic that I am asked about frequently, and it is about different diets. So I'm going to talk about mainly the diets that I've tried. If you guys have any questions about other diets and just my perspective on them, be sure to hit me up in the comments below, and I will answer as many questions as I can. It is not a comprehensive list of all of the diets that I've tried. This is a lot of the common diets that I've tried and the ones that I've stuck with for a while enough to have a reasonably comprehensive perspective on. So I am going to comment on those and give as much detail as possible. And yeah, that's just what this video is going to be about. Really, I want to go over my approach to diets a little bit first before diving into the diets themselves. So really, I approach diets in phases, and some of the diets are already broken down into phases. And so what I mean by phases is that a lot of foods have different degrees of digestibility depending on where you are coming from. Some people will be watching this video and thinking about trying a new diet, and they'll have some degree of digestive issues, whether it is they have looseness, diarrhea like IBS with diarrhea, or they have constipation, or they have some other digestive issues like they have insufficient bile, insufficient stomach acid, a variety of different things, and that's going to affect your digestibility of a lot of foods. And a lot of these diets are good to go in phases where you include a lot of the easiest to digest foods at the beginning. And then you incorporate more and more of the more difficult to digest foods. And like the more difficult examples of the more difficult to digest foods are like raw vegetables with the rinds on them, a lot of grains, some of the different type of FODMAP type foods, that kind of stuff. You save all of those more difficult to digest foods for the end, and that just makes the startup and getting the feel of the diet a bit more pleasant when you're actually able to digest the foods of the diet that you're trying to eat. So it's very helpful. So I try and approach all of them in phases, even if the phases haven't been strictly defined by the creators of the diet. In several of the cases, like with GAPS and specific carb diets and some of the other ones that I'm going to talk about, those phases are very strictly defined, or like fairly strictly defined, and you can find easy guides and easy printouts to really help you. And then some of them you're going to have to break down yourself based on where your gut's at and what your goals are and all of that. So just do some trial and error. The second one is if you are coming from a place where you don't digest a lot of foods, all that, you only want to be trying one food every couple of days. For me, I try it every 2 days. That seems to be the sweet spot for being able to determine on like the 3 different major axes that I track for food tolerability. And I guess the 3 axes that I'll track or digestibility, my body's ability to break that food down. And so any interruption in the quality of digestion, with evidence the next morning, is going to be for or against continuing with that. And then the second axis is the histamine allergy type response. So some of you might not know what I'm talking about. Some of you definitely will because you have a huge histamine response to foods. And so with some foods, people who have digestive issues are going to have an inability, or they're going to have a strong bodily response to that food. And the response, like the histamine type response that I'm referring to, can be headaches, they can be asthmatic type reactions, congestion, stuff like that. And so a lot of people, like especially after having stuff like milk or like milk products, cheese, any dairy product, they will have congestion. They'll have nasal congestion, it will turn into mucus that goes down their throat and everything. And so that will be like a very common response. And so that's why there's the typical recommendation or like folk tale or whatever that you shouldn't have milk products when you're sick because they just increase the amount of mucus that you have. And so that's the second axis, right? And so the third axis is inflammation. So that kind of ties into the second one. But in this case, inflammation is really a broader category that kind of encompasses any type of autoimmune inflammatory reaction that you have. And so for me, like the inflammation like I had, or depending on how you look at it, like still have Crohn's disease that's just in remission and has been in remission without medication for a very long time. But some foods can trigger an inflammatory reaction that might be similar to an autoimmune reaction that you've had in the past. And so sometimes if I have, I guess like the last one that triggered it for me is like marshmallows. So with marshmallows, I had a painful inflammatory reaction that's really like an IBS type reaction. It's localized pain in the gut. Why marshmallows caused it? I don't know, other than the sugar content, even though other sugars don't do it. who knows? But testing those foods and paying attention to how you feel and only trying one food at a time really gives you a very clear idea of how your body's reacting to those foods. And tracking the different axes of tolerability is very useful for figuring out what your issues really are, to what foods you tolerate now and what foods you can potentially tolerate in the future. Because if you're able to tolerate like applesauce really well, right? Like you might be able to tolerate whole apples as well, because whole apples are typically more difficult to digest than apple juice or applesauce. And after successfully tolerating applesauce, your next step is to skin an apple and have an apple, a fresh, raw skinned apple. And then if that goes well, then you can try normal apples. And so you progress in your food introductions as your digestibility increases. And so that's really useful. And so now I'm going to dive into the diets themselves, now that I explained how I approached them, what's really worked for me. Some of the diets that I've tried are GAPS, as I mentioned, a specific carb diet, FODMAP diet, keto, Mediterranean diet, vegetarian, vegan diet, including like a pescatarian diet, and I guess like an ovo-vegetarian diet, right, where I'd have eggs and or fish. And then the elemental diet, which is a very specialized diet and different from all of the other diets. And the last one that I tried is actually a high fiber diet that I tried after reading a book called Fiber Fueled, and I'll dive into that one as well. So let's start with the good. The good are diets that had incredible digestibility for my gut and where I was at. And that's really the GAPS and the FODMAP diet. Actually, that is really the GAPS, the SCD, and the FODMAP diet. Those three were amazing for digestibility, tolerability, very minimal side effects for the most part, and the ability to eat at least most of the foods that are on that list, being able to follow the phases that they recommend, and tolerating a lot of what's on them. So those were great. There's not a huge amount of difference between all of those diets. FODMAP is more restrictive in some ways, in that some of the things that you're allowed on GAPS and SCD are contradicted by the FODMAP, but I think they're actually useful in combination, in that some of the FODMAP restrictions make a lot of sense for people who are very reactive to FODMAPs to carry over into GAPS and SCD, even though those foods are allowed on the GAPS and SCD diets. And so that's why I think the approaching things in phases and introducing foods at every 2 to 3 days and titrating up on the amount of foods that you have gives you a very good idea of what your body wants and needs. And you start with one of these diets as a framework. If you want to try one of the three that I just mentioned, you start with one as a framework, and then you try and incorporate all of the foods that you can from that diet. Then you can look to these other very successful diets for help as well. And GAPS and SCD, going on those, that was actually the first time that I felt normal and energetic and refreshed after sleep and everything after a long time. So I had like maybe 5 years where I just felt terrible on a day-to-day basis. I was not digesting anything well, and going to phase 1 of the GAPS diet, reading the book, and then implementing everything that they had in there. That was really the first time that my gut started to feel better, that I started to have formed stools, and I started to have energy and to wake up not feeling just terrible in the morning, like hungover, stressed, anxious, and like completely lacking energy at the same time. It's just a terrible feeling. And so on those diets, that was really when I first started making progress. And that was probably like 10 years ago now. And really things went up from there, because as soon as I had more energy, I was able to dedicate more time to researching more diets and to learning about all of these processes for figuring out which foods my body actually wants. And everything has been on an upward spiral since then. So those are the really good diets. So let's go into some of the bad diets now. As I mentioned, the last diet that I mentioned was the high fiber diet, which was created by a gastroenterologist and like a medical researcher, and it's very scientifically backed, but I found out pretty quickly that there's a very low limit to the amount of fiber that my gut will tolerate. I assume it's because I had Crohn's disease and IBS, D, and a number of other issues, but my gut did not want a lot of fiber. So I started some of the recipes on there, and I started getting like very warm, being unable to sleep at night, maybe more than 2 to 3 hours. So I would like have energy and my gut would be digesting the food, but I would feel terrible. And what I think it was is fiber actually creates more serotonin, or I don't know if the serotonin is produced in the gut, but it stimulates your body to produce more serotonin. And I think at some points I was even potentially bordering on serotonin syndrome because I felt feverish and was completely unable to sleep and all this other stuff. And it was very unpleasant. And so as soon as I backed down on the amount of fiber that I was taking, things like my body started calming down. I started being able to sleep 4 to 5 hours a night, and then eventually 6 to 7, then 8 hours a night. And I started feeling a lot better. My gut calmed down. And now, like a year after I tried that diet, I can definitely tolerate more fiber. And so I've tried reintroducing some of those recipes to pretty good success. So I think the high fiber diet can be really good depending on where you're at. If you are in a place where your gut doesn't want a lot of fiber, if you have inflammation, if you have IBS-D, it might not be the best to dive into that one real deep. But if you have like constipation or some other dietary issues, but you don't have a hypersensitive gut, like you don't have IBS, I think it could be really good and it could be worth a try. And certainly fiber is very important, right? So fiber, and really the science behind that diet is that fiber is fermented into butyrate, acetate, and propionate. And those substances are really responsible for maintenance of homeostasis, feed like the colonocytes and the other important human cells in the gut, maintaining the immune system of the gut. And so without fiber, you're not going to be getting those substances unless you supplement them, which very few people actually supplement butyrate and acetate and propionate. So you would be much better just slowly introducing the fiber and perhaps using that as like an adjunct diet to GAPS and SCD as the fiber is tolerated. So again, I think one of the most important messages that I'm stressing with talking about these diets is you need to figure out what's right for you. And all of these diets are great frameworks, and you need to figure out what is right for you. Like you can't jump into a diet and be like, all right, this worked for someone else, it's going to work perfectly for me. Like we're all different. There's in most people several thousand different species of gut microbiota, and they're going to be different depending on what you ate your entire life, whether or not you're breastfed, like your genetics, your environmental exposures, your particular immune system challenges, autoimmunity, that kind of stuff. And so you need to figure it out for yourself. You need to use that as a template. You need to start testing that template and seeing how well you do with it, and then go from there. Right. That being said, the next diet I want to talk about that wasn't great was the high protein diet. So digestively, or the digestibility of that diet was great. I digested all of that protein super well. It's really just a lot of like chicken and pork and protein shakes and that kind of stuff. And that one digested really well. The problem was one of the byproducts of protein fermentation is a lot of gas, right? And so the gas really got to me. It was giving me headaches and obviously making me very flatulent, which made me popular with my family. So, that wasn't all that fun. And obviously with a high protein diet, I wasn't getting as much plant nutrients and everything, and I wasn't getting enough carbs. And so I think some of the headaches were due to that excessive amount of gas putting pressure in my gut. But then also I wasn't getting enough carbs, and I was still doing, like, I've been in IT for like almost 20 years now. And in IT, you have to think a lot, right? Like you're typing and doing a lot of different computer related stuff. You're constantly having to think and interact with people and machines and do programming and whatever else you do in IT. And you need a lot of carbs. And on a high protein diet, you're not getting enough carbs. There's going to be issues there. And so that would give me headaches, and I would feel low energy and not be able to participate as much as I wanted to in meetings and all of that stuff. It was just not great. So again, high protein can be effective for some people. The digestibility was great, but it definitely has some downsides. So I wouldn't recommend it, especially as a starting. And the next one, kind of similar to high protein, is high fat keto. And keto did not go well at all. So it's really difficult to get a ton of fats that are not dairy with keto. So really, for the most part, if you want to avoid a lot of processed food at the same time, like you're limited to a lot of coconut oil and coconut fat type products, which on me and a lot of people will have a very laxative effect. And so coming from a place of IBS-D and Crohn's where there's already a lot of that, it just made it so much worse. Like I'd have to go to the bathroom like 5 times a day. And it was not fun. The meat part of it was all digested great, went really well. The dairy products, like I, didn't really have a lot of cheese prior to that, but adding in a ton of cheese and other dairy products also didn't go well. So I think keto is really difficult to maintain for people that have digestive issues, but for people who digest well, it's worth a shot. And there's plenty of science validating the keto diet. That's why I was trying to go for it, because in addition to having the GI issues I had, and some Parkinsonian type symptoms and some dystonias, movement disorders, some mild seizures, stuff like that. And so really my attempt to go to the keto diet was to try and ameliorate some of those neurological effects. And that's, what a lot of the scientific basis of the keto diet's for. You put your body in a state of ketoacidosis, you produce ketones, and ketones are a more efficient energy source than glucose. And so your brain is burning ketones, and at least theoretically, or at least validated by enough studies in a segment of the population, those ketones prevent a lot of the neurological side effects that you'd have when using glucose as a primary fuel source. But for me, it didn't actually work. Probably because a lot of those neurological issues are caused by the gut or by issues in the gut. And the gut is connected to the brain through the vagus nerve, and the gut produces a lot of neurotransmitters. And so a lot of inflammatory processes and things going on in the gut make their way back up to the brain, cause issues. And so that's at least what I found, is that the happier my gut is, the happier the neurological symptoms for me have been. And then eventually they started going away as I really got my digestion under control. Yeah, back to keto. I wouldn't recommend keto for most people with digestive issues. I think keto is incredibly tasty. It can work for some people. For people that have really good digestion and kind of want to explore it, the ability for ketones to be more efficient energy source, especially if you really like MCT oil, coconut oil, and/or lots of dairy and high fat meats. I think it's great. You can cycle it. I wouldn't recommend doing it for too long. There's a lot of studies and science showing that a lot of dairy and red meat is really bad for you due to the cross reactivity in beef, like especially A1 beef and milk products with the human body. And so let's see, the last diet that I wanted to go through that was very effective at treating symptoms and for inducing permanent changes in my digestion, but was incredibly unpleasant, was the elemental diet. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. If you are coming from a place of GI issues, you've heard of the elemental diet. It is basically a terrible tapioca tasting protein shake. It basically tastes like tapioca and vitamins. And you have these shakes, you have a full caloric replacement of these shakes, which is for most people going to be between like 2,000 to 2,500 calories, which is like 4 to 5 full shakes, like double, triple scoop shakes of this vitamin-y tapioca that burns your stomach. And it causes a lot of issues. So for me, I got a lot of burning in the stomach. I had a lot of diarrhea, like 5 or so times a day. I had a lot of palpitations while it was going on. I think my gut was really irritated. The vagus nerve was irritated. It was causing some palpitations as well. I felt like really weird and weak for the most. I had a decent amount of energy despite all of that. But yeah, I was really still miserable the entire time because my stomach was just constantly in a state of burning, and I was having to force this like terrible tasting vitamin-y mixture like into my stomach and resisting the urge to gag and all of this stuff. And it is very unpleasant to do, and you have to do it for several weeks. Like optimally, if you're trying to treat SIBO, you're doing it for 3 weeks. And it is very difficult. Like you are constantly craving non-elemental diet foods, and you can't have anything. You can have elemental diet, you can have like weak tea and coffee, and you can have water. And like I found that having tea and coffee just made it worse, except for maybe like ginger and chamomile tea. Having like black tea for the caffeine didn't go well. Having coffee didn't go well because all of that brought about more stomach acid, and more stomach acid just made my stomach burn even more. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend doing either of that, having either coffee or black tea with it, but I would recommend doing the elemental diet for SIBO, right? It's incredibly effective. It's a great alternative to using antibiotics. Antibiotics can have tons of side effects. So I would recommend or stay away from them. Like I personally stay away from them as much as possible. A lot of my health issues were caused by excessive use of antibiotics. So yeah, I would personally stay away from them. But again, like using the elemental diet instead of antibiotics for treatment of SIBO was really up in the air, right? Like I know factually that most people won't be able to complete a cycle of treatment. Like they won't be able to make it through 2 to 3 weeks. Like it takes a lot of willpower to make it through 2 to 3 weeks of drinking terrible tapioca shakes that burn your insides. It is very uncomfortable, very painful. And yeah, unless you have like really bad SIBO or like some really bad health condition and like you need antibiotics or the elemental diet for treatment, like I wouldn't recommend it. It's not even like good for weight loss, right? Like I maintained the exact same weight on the diet despite having the diarrhea and having these terrible shakes because like they replace all of your calories fully. So I was getting 2,400 calories a day in this easily digestible form, and so you don't lose any weight. So for a lot of people, there's just not going to be any other benefit. You really only want to use the elemental diet when it's that like you have to do that or take antibiotics. So yeah, I think that's it. That is all of the diets that I have experimented at least with lately. I have a lot of detailed notes on these, including a lot of like health metrics and stuff from my life at the time, like blood pressure, heart rate, like all of that stuff. If you guys are interested, I can make some more in-depth videos. If you have any more questions on these diets, my experience with them or anything, hit me up in the comments below. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and I'll look forward to talking with you guys again. Thanks. Bye.